Ethan Carter prided himself on being a rational man. Superstitions were for fools, and myths belonged in children's bedtime stories, not in the real world. But his belief in logic was tested the day a crimson envelope appeared in his mailbox. It wasn't the typical junk mail or bills he was used to. The envelope was heavy, its surface smooth like velvet. His name was scrawled in golden ink, shimmering faintly under the winter sun. Intrigued, Ethan opened it and pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment. "Dear Ethan, the holiday season is here, and I've been keeping an eye on the naughty and nice. Below is a list of the naughty people in your life. Beware, as actions have consequences. Confess your sins, or the blacklist will act. Santa." Ethan smirked. Santa? Really? He figured it was some sort of elaborate prank, maybe a new viral marketing scheme. But when he unfolded the parchment further, his smirk vanished. The paper contained 5 names written in sharp black ink: Jake Bennett, Laura Harper, Tim Collins, Sarah Bell, Ethan Carter. His breath caught when he saw his own name at the bottom. A strange chill ran down his spine, and he found himself instinctively glancing over his shoulder, though the street was empty. Tossing the letter on the kitchen counter, he tried to laugh it off. "Someone's got a weird sense of humor," he muttered. But the following morning, laughter was the last thing on his mind. Jake Bennett, Ethan's boss, was dead. The news headline flashed on his phone: "Businessman found dead in office. Mysterious injuries baffle police." The article described gruesome claw-like marks across Jake's face and neck, injuries that couldn't be explained. Ethan tried to rationalize it. A freak accident? A robbery gone wrong? But his stomach churned as he remembered Jake's name on the letter. It was just a coincidence, wasn't it? That illusion shattered 2 days later when Laura Harper, his nosy, overbearing neighbor, was found strangled in her garden. The police said her own garden hose had been the weapon. Ethan had complained about Laura to anyone who would listen, her intrusive questions, her constant gossiping. Tim Collins was next. Ethan hadn't spoken to Tim in years, not since their friendship ended in betrayal. When Ethan saw the news that Tim had drowned in his own bathtub, he couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. The deaths weren't random. They were deliberate, methodical, and tied to the names on the list. By the time Sarah Bell's name was crossed off, Ethan was consumed by fear. Sarah, his ex-girlfriend, had exposed his darkest secrets during their bitter breakup. Her body was found surrounded by shattered mirrors, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. 4 names were crossed off. Only one remained, his own. The weight of the letter pressed on Ethan's mind. The final line echoed like a taunt: "Confess your sins, or the black list will act." He racked his brain, desperate to understand what he needed to confess. Sure, he wasn't perfect, but what sins could possibly justify this? Then a memory surfaced. One he had buried deep. Years ago, in a desperate bid to save his career, he had framed a colleague for embezzlement. The man lost everything: his job, his family, and eventually, his life. Guilt clawed at Ethan. Was this his punishment? He went to the church in desperation, confessing everything to the priest. The priest listened quietly, offering prayers and absolution, but it wasn't enough to calm Ethan's racing heart. He burned the letter that night, hoping to break whatever curse was tied to it. As the ashes floated into the cold night air, he allowed himself a moment of relief. But relief was short-lived. At midnight, the temperature in his apartment dropped. His breath fogged in the air, and shadows began to stretch unnaturally along the walls. A deep, guttural voice resonated in the silence. "You didn't confess everything, Ethan." Panic set in. He pleaded with the unseen force, but the shadows began to coalesce. A monstrous figure emerged, twisted and grotesque, its face a distorted mockery of Santa Claus. Its hollow eyes gleamed with malice, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. "You made the list, Ethan. And now, it's time to pay." Ethan screamed as the creature lunged, its claws sinking into him. The next morning, the police found his lifeless body in his apartment. The scene was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Beside him lay a crimson envelope, untouched by the fire. The black list was inside, with Ethan's name crossed off. And at the bottom of the list, a new name had appeared, written in black ink. The curse wasn't over. It had simply moved on to its next victim. Elena was known in her small town as the Queen of Christmas baking. Every year, her elaborate gingerbread creations wowed judges at the annual Christmas bake-off. This year, she outdid herself, a towering gingerbread house complete with caramel windows, licorice shingles, and a marshmallow snowman guarding the candy cane door. As the contest day approached, she spent every waking hour perfecting the details. She piped intricate icing patterns on the walls, sculpted chocolate trees, and crafted spun sugar icicles that glittered like real frost. By the time she finished, exhaustion overtook her, and she collapsed onto the couch in her kitchen. That night, strange dreams consumed her. She saw her gingerbread house, but it wasn't sitting on her countertop anymore. It loomed over her, life-sized and glowing softly under a pale moon. The marshmallow snowman seemed to turn its head and smile, its licorice mouth stretching unnaturally wide. When Elena woke, the world around her felt different. She was no longer in her cozy kitchen, but standing in a vast snow-covered clearing. Before her stood the gingerbread house, just as she had crafted it, only now it was massive. The caramel windows gleamed in the moonlight, and the sweet scent of ginger and sugar filled the air. Elena's heart raced. She stepped closer, her boots crunching on the frosted ground. The marshmallow snowman still guarded the entrance, but now its black gumdrop eyes followed her every move. "I must still be dreaming," she whispered, her breath visible in the icy air. Hesitantly, she pushed open the candy cane door. Inside, the sugary sweetness turned cloying. The walls, lined with frosting and candy, seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The air was thick with a saccharine scent that made her head spin. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, but the candy cane handle was gone, replaced by a solid wall of gingerbread. "Elena," a voice purred, smooth as melted chocolate. She turned, her eyes widening in horror. The marshmallow snowman stood in the center of the room, its grin stretching impossibly wide. Its gumdrop buttons oozed a dark, sticky syrup. "Welcome to your masterpiece," it said, bowing mockingly. What is this?" she stammered. "A test," the snowman replied, its licorice arms extending grotesquely. "Your greed, your pride, your obsession, they've brought you here. Now let's see if you can escape." Before she could respond, the walls began to shift. Licorice ropes shot out, narrowly missing her as she dove to the side. The floor split open, revealing a bubbling pit of molten sugar. Elena scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She ran into the next room, only to find herself surrounded by candy creatures, gumdrop bears with jagged teeth, chocolate rabbits with hollow eyes, and twisted peppermint snakes that slithered toward her. She grabbed a candy cane from the wall, using it to fend off the creatures as she searched for a way out. Room after room, the traps grew deadlier. Giant gingerbread men stomped after her, their frosting mouths roaring with laughter. Razor-sharp shards of caramel rained from above. In one room, the floor was made of brittle sugar glass that cracked beneath her feet, threatening to plunge her into a dark abyss. Exhausted and terrified, Elena finally stumbled into a room that looked familiar. It was the centerpiece of her creation, the grand dining hall. In the center stood a table covered in glittering confections and a single glowing cupcake. Above it hung a sign in icing, "Eat to escape." Elena hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her not to trust it, but the walls around her began closing in, frosting tendrils creeping toward her. Desperation took over. She grabbed the cupcake and took a bite. The room dissolved around her in a whirlwind of sugar and light. She woke up back in her kitchen, her heart pounding and her hands sticky with frosting. The gingerbread house sat on the counter, untouched but somehow darker, its candy decorations slightly melted. Elena didn't take it to the contest. Instead, she destroyed it piece by piece, burning the remains in her fireplace. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. That Christmas, no one saw Elena's usual festive creations. But in the dark corners of her home, faint laughter echoed, and the smell of gingerbread lingered long after the fire had burned out. It was the 1st of December when young Lily received an old antique advent calendar from her grandmother. The calendar was unlike any other she had ever seen, crafted from dark wood with intricate carved designs of angels, reindeer, and cryptic symbols. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that seemed strangely out of place for the season. The calendar had 24 little doors, each hiding a mysterious picture beneath. Her grandmother had warned her, "Be careful with this one, dear. It's not just a calendar, it's a reminder of things better left alone." But Lily, too excited for the holiday season, dismissed her grandmother's words as nonsense. The first door opened with ease, revealing a scene of a lone figure standing in a snow-covered forest, looking lost and terrified. Below the picture was a single cryptic phrase, "The lost wanderer shall never return." That evening, Lily's family sat down to dinner. The wind howled outside and the house creaked under the weight of a coming storm. But the evening seemed peaceful enough until a knock at the door interrupted their meal. A distraught man stood on their doorstep, his face pale with fear. "Please, I need help," he begged, his voice shaky. "I was on my way home when a blizzard hit and I got lost. Can I come in?" The family, despite their unease, invited him inside. But as the man stepped into the warmth of the home, his eyes widened in terror. He turned on his heels and fled into the night, his panicked screams echoing through the empty streets. Lily stared, wide-eyed, at the Advent calendar. The message from the first door was no longer just a strange picture. It had become reality. She felt a chill run down her spine. That was no coincidence. Something far darker was at play. The next day, she opened the second door. This time, it showed a person hanging from a noose, their face contorted in agony. The message below read, "The price of silence is paid in blood." Later that evening, the family sat down for a quiet evening of board games, but they were interrupted by a knock at the door. This time it was their neighbor, Mrs. Walters. She stood stiffly in the doorway, her face pale and lifeless. "I have to tell you something," she whispered hoarsely. "I've heard strange sounds in my house, voices calling my name in the night, and I've seen shadows moving where there are no people." Her eyes flickered toward the calendar on the mantel. "You must destroy it before it's too late." But before anyone could respond, Mrs. Walters' voice turned into a horrifying scream as something unseen dragged her out into the snow. The family rushed outside, but there was no sign of her. The only trace was a blood-stained patch of snow. Lily felt the calendar's power grow stronger. Each night, the events that followed the pictures and messages from the doors became more real, more horrifying. The third door showed a scene of a family sitting at a table, their faces frozen in terror. The message read, "The feast will be their last." That night, their neighbors, the Thompson family, invited them over for a Christmas dinner. But as they sat around the table, the lights flickered and an unnatural silence filled the air. Suddenly the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on them. The Thompsons' faces twisted in agony, their screams muffled as they turned to stone before their eyes. Each day the calendar's messages became more detailed, more specific, foretelling terrible events with frightening accuracy. Lily's family tried everything to stop it, burning the calendar, locking it away, even leaving the house. But no matter what they did, the next day's door opened, and the events described in it came to pass. Desperate, Lily and her family began researching the calendar's origins, discovering a dark tale tied to the ancient craftsmanship. The Advent calendar had once belonged to a family of witches who used it to predict their victims' doom, trapping their souls in the calendar itself. The only way to stop it was to confront the calendar on Christmas Eve and destroy it before the final door opened. But time was running out. On Christmas Eve, with dread gnawing at their hearts, Lily's family gathered around the calendar. As they opened the final door, they were met with a horrifying scene. A dark, twisted version of their home, with their own bodies lying in pools of blood. The message read, "On Christmas Day, the final price shall be paid." The calendar began to glow, and a chill filled the room. Shadows seemed to stretch toward them, pulling at their skin, their very souls. With no other choice, Lily gathered her courage and picked up the calendar. She held it to the fire, but it refused to burn, the flames licking harmlessly at its surface. Desperation took over as she screamed, "You have to stop! This can't be the end!" Suddenly the calendar cracked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, a small ancient key glimmered. With trembling hands, Lily inserted it into the back of the calendar, and with a thunderous roar, the house shook. The calendar shattered, and a terrifying wail filled the room. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The Advent calendar was gone, but so were the horrors it had brought. The family was safe, for now. However, as Lily sat down that night, exhausted and trembling, she swore she could hear a faint whisper in the back of her mind, the voice of the calendar's curse. The price of life is eternal, and there's always another soul to claim. The calendar might have been destroyed, but its legacy was far from over.